Mark Rawson never imagined that the quietest street in the quietest town would become the most volatile environment he'd ever encountered. As a federal arbiter for HOA-related disputes, he had seen enough power struggles, passive-aggressive letters, and regulatory warfare to last several lifetimes. He'd witnessed neighborhoods implode over shrub height regulations and families forced into bankruptcy over disputed fence placements. That was precisely why he had sworn to never live under an HOA himself. Yet here he was, unloading cardboard boxes onto a neatly paved driveway in a modest cul-de-sac under the jurisdiction of the Cedar Pines Homeowners Association. It wasn't hypocrisy that brought him here. It was curiosity. A kind of slow-burning professional fatigue had crept into his life, and despite his reputation as a resolute and impartial adjudicator, he wanted to see things from the inside, to walk among the governed without being recognized as one of the governing. So he'd bought the property under a legal alias, entirely within bounds for federal employees in high-risk professions, and made sure that none of his new neighbors could Google his name and find court transcripts or publish decisions with his initials on them. He wasn't hiding, he was observing. The house itself was nothing extraordinary. A one-story brick home with weathered shutters and a front porch that faced an identical row of properties. It was deliberately plain. He had no interest in drawing attention, just in existing among the suburban machinery to understand what it felt like to be under someone else's rule. His first few days were blissfully uneventful. He arranged furniture, repainted the mailbox, and installed a modest wooden bench near the curb, something an old friend had crafted by hand and gifted him years ago. It was the only personal item that sat outside, weathered and unassuming, but filled with sentimental weight. He placed it beneath the old sycamore tree near the sidewalk. It was solid, clean, and positioned carefully so that it wouldn't block any pedestrian traffic. The bench drew no comments. Not at first. Neighbors passed by and waved. A few paused to say hello, remark on the late autumn weather, or compliment the well-kept lawn. Mark kept his tone neutral, pleasant but distant. He knew better than to get too close too quickly. The HOA structure thrived on comfort with hierarchy, and the last thing he wanted was to be read as out of place. The neighborhood itself had an eerie symmetry to it, not just in the houses, but in the behaviors of its people. Lawns were trimmed to the same height. Porch furniture followed a similar color palette. Even the dogs, it seemed, barked at consistent intervals. There was a quiet, creeping precision to everything that didn't sit quite right with him, though he couldn't say why. One morning, just before sunrise, he stepped outside to find a single sheet of paper tucked into his front door. It was professionally printed on off-white paper, embossed with the dark green logo of the HOA. He unfolded it, expecting perhaps a welcome message or a neighborhood newsletter. Instead, the heading read, "Non-Compliance Notice. Safety Violation. Unsecured Furniture Placement." Below it was a grainy, zoomed-in photograph of the wooden bench he had installed, with a red circle drawn around one of its legs. The leg, according to the form, was visibly unstable and in violation of community safety standards. He stared at the image for a long time, then looked across the street. Every other house had decorative items along the sidewalk. Bird feeders, garden gnomes, even a small trellis over a mailbox. But none of those were marked as violations. Only his bench. He crouched beside it, checking each joint by hand. It didn't wobble, didn't creak. He applied pressure to the seat, leaned his weight into the backrest. Nothing moved. If anything, it was sturdier than most of the HOA's vinyl-approved garden chairs that dotted neighboring lawns. He sat down, quietly, and looked out over the cul-de-sac. A curtain twitched in one of the windows across the street. He had a feeling he was being watched, not out of paranoia, but with the certainty that came from years of reading people who believed they were invisible. Someone had taken that photo. Someone had waited until the light hit the angle just right. And now, whoever it was, they had decided the bench had to go. Mark folded the notice, placed it on his lap, and let out a slow breath. He'd lived through more intense conflicts than a suburban disagreement over a piece of street furniture. But this wasn't about the bench. It was a move, a signal. Someone in this neighborhood had recognized something about him, or thought they had, and they were testing the ground. What they didn't know, and what Mark didn't plan to reveal just yet, was that they'd chosen the worst possible person to play this game with. The next morning, Mark did what any reasonable new resident would do. He called the HOA office listed on the notice. The woman who answered introduced herself as Claudia, speaking with the clipped, perfunctory politeness of someone who had already made their judgment long before picking up the phone. Mark asked calmly for clarification regarding the violation. Claudia explained that the HOA had received multiple concerns about an unauthorized installation that posed potential injury risks to pedestrian traffic and would be escalating the matter to a formal review if the bench wasn't removed by the end of the week. When Mark asked for specifics, who had reported the concern, what exactly was considered dangerous, Claudia simply said, "The decision was made in accordance with the Community Safety Review Protocol. It's all in the handbook you were given upon closing." She then offered to email him a digital copy in case he had misplaced the original. The conversation ended with a rehearsed warning. Failure to comply may result in daily fines as outlined under subsection 3.7. Mark thanked her without emotion, hung up, and stood in his silent kitchen for a long while, looking out the window at the now infamous bench beneath the sycamore. He hadn't misplaced the handbook. He had read it in its entirety on the first night he moved in, because that's what he did with governing documents. He studied them. And there was no mention of a prohibition against standalone furniture placed on one's own lawn within the visible boundary, as long as it wasn't obstructing walkways or attached to public fixtures. Which it wasn't. It wasn't even close. That afternoon, Mark decided to walk the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, not as a spy but as a quiet observer, documenting items on other properties that, under the same logic, should also constitute violations. He counted 17 lawn statues, 3 unanchored porch swings, 2 planters balanced on bricks, and at least a dozen decorative fences that extended several inches beyond the legal setback. Some of them looked lovely. Some looked absolutely unstable. All of them had gone unmentioned. He took photos, never intrusively, never pointing the camera directly, but just wide shots to capture context. It wasn't about preparing a case. It was about confirming a pattern. The enforcement was selective. That much was now beyond doubt. He hadn't even completed the loop around the cul-de-sac when he noticed 2 women standing near a mailbox watching him. They were mid-50s, tidy in dress, and fell into silence as he approached. He gave a polite nod. One of them smiled, too quickly, too tightly. The other simply turned her back. Mark didn't take offense. In fact, he found it telling. In communities like this, silence said far more than words. That evening, a second notice appeared in his mailbox. This one was thicker, printed in color, and bordered with red. Pre-litigation advisory, non-compliance review in progress. Attached was a photograph taken from what appeared to be across the street at a low angle. The bench was circled again, but now the photo included a mock-up showing a stick figure tripping near the bench. The image had been edited crudely but deliberately. Below it was a line of bold text. "In the event of injury, the homeowner bears all liability." A second paragraph outlined a projected fine schedule, beginning at $50 per day, increasing weekly. There was something almost performative about the notice, like it wasn't designed to inform but to unnerve. It was a stage piece, part of a theater of intimidation. Mark placed the papers beside the first one, sat at the table, and opened his laptop. He searched the HOA's board directory and began matching names to properties. The president of the HOA was listed as Beverly A. Downing, the same name printed in small letters at the bottom of the second notice. She lived 3 houses down, in the home with the unnaturally perfect roses and the symmetrical white shutters that never opened. Mark had passed her once, an elegant woman in tailored denim and pearl earrings who nodded in his direction with the detached precision of a flight attendant closing the cabin door. He waited until mid-morning the next day before walking down to the HOA office. It was located inside a converted community clubhouse, once intended for birthday parties and weekend mixers, now repurposed into administrative dominance. The interior was austere, decorated with outdated motivational posters and dry erase boards filled with procedural timelines. Claudia, the woman from the phone, sat at the front desk. Her expression barely flickered when she saw him. Mark asked to speak with Beverly Downing. Claudia replied that Miss Downing didn't take unscheduled meetings. Mark responded, without raising his voice, that as a homeowner he was entitled to request clarification directly from the issuing authority of a formal notice. Claudia reluctantly disappeared into the back office. 5 minutes later, Beverly emerged. She was taller than Mark had expected, with a long stride and shoulders squared like a fencer. Her smile was composed but carried an unmistakable stiffness, like it had been ironed flat rather than grown organically. She did not offer a seat. "You're the gentleman with the bench," she said. "I am," Mark replied. "I'd like to understand the basis for the violation." The structure is secure, positioned well back from the curb, and not in breach of any written codes. Beverly gestured toward the wall, where a laminated sheet titled Community Aesthetic and Risk Principles was tacked beside a clock. "Not everything is black and white, Mr. Rawson. Our guidelines permit the board to exercise judgment in matters where safety or visual harmony is compromised." Mark studied her face, not her words. She was gauging him, trying to assess whether he would push or fold. He gave her neither. "That may be," he said, "but your citation relies on an assertion of instability that doesn't exist. No inspection was conducted. No formal complaint documented. The images used in your warning appear to have been staged." Beverly's expression cooled by several degrees. "We appreciate your attention to detail. However, we advise full compliance with board recommendations until further review. Resistance may be interpreted as non-cooperative conduct. And as you may know, patterns of non-cooperation can influence how we address future concerns." That was it. A veiled threat, wrapped in policy speak. Mark nodded once, turned, and walked out. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't issue a counter-threat. But as he stepped into the sunlight and headed back to his house, something shifted internally. Not a spark of anger, but the slow activation of something dormant. They had made a mistake. They thought they were managing an ordinary resident. What they didn't realize was that they had made their move on someone who knew exactly how their machinery operated. Back at home, Mark didn't remove the bench. He reinforced it. Bolted it to a poured concrete pad beneath the soil and ran a sealant line around the base. If they wanted to remove it, they'd have to dig through stone. He printed a laminated sign and zip-tied it to the armrest. "Private property, for non-commercial personal use." Legally worded, unobtrusive, but firm. Then he waited. 2 days passed without incident. On the 3rd morning, he found a new notice taped to his garage door. This one was hand-signed. It read, "You're not who you say you are, Mr. Rawson." There was no name, no logo, just a sentence, centered on the page like a whisper in a quiet room. Mark stood for a long time, the notice fluttering slightly in the breeze. That was when he knew. They weren't trying to fine him anymore. They were trying to flush him out. And whoever had written that line wasn't guessing. They were certain. The question now wasn't whether the HOA would escalate. It was how far they were willing to go. Mark didn't touch the note taped to his garage. He read it once more, then walked back inside, leaving it to hang there like a flag, an invitation or provocation depending on the reader. He knew better than to respond immediately. Whoever had left it wanted him unsettled. Instead, he went about his morning routine with clinical precision. He made coffee, watered the plants, reviewed a stack of mediation summaries from his past cases, but every movement was underscored by tension, a quiet pressure against the back of his neck. The line, "You're not who you say you are, Mr. Rawson," had not come from a stranger fishing in the dark. It had been written with purpose, and its phrasing carried an unmistakable weight. Not an accusation, but a declaration. For the next 2 days, the neighborhood returned to its usual rhythm, or at least the surface of it did. Lawns were mowed in perfect diagonals. Sprinklers hissed on cue. Children rode scooters in single-file lines as if choreographed. But something had shifted beneath it all. People still waved to Mark, but their smiles were thinner, more obligatory. He noticed eyes lingered a second longer than usual when he passed. Conversation stopped just a moment too early when he turned the corner. He began to feel the subtle, suffocating pressure of a community that had decided he wasn't one of them. And more than that, he was an anomaly that needed to be reabsorbed, corrected, or removed. The escalation came not with a bang, but with a noise, an odd, rhythmic clatter that woke him at 5:12 a.m. on a Wednesday. Still groggy, Mark opened his bedroom window and leaned out. It took him a moment to process what he was seeing. 2 men in fluorescent vests were standing on the sidewalk near his property line, hammering a wooden stake into the ground. Attached to the stake was a square sign, freshly printed and laminated. Pending review. Community Safety Obstruction. Below the title was a vague paragraph referencing Article 6 of the HOA bylaws, authorizing temporary designation of hazardous structures pending community review. Mark stepped outside barefoot, still in his t-shirt, and approached them. "Who authorized this?" Neither of them looked at him directly. One muttered, "We were sent by the board," and pointed vaguely toward the direction of the office. "What review? What hazard?" "Not our call, sir." "We're just implementing placement protocol." "Then stop implementing." "We're not authorized to remove signage once it's posted. You'll need to contact the board directly." Mark didn't argue. He watched them walk off, then stood there in the early morning light, staring at the sign that had just redefined his property, not legally, but socially. The implication of hazard was enough to stain reputation, enough to create discomfort and distance from neighbors who might otherwise reserve judgment. That was the point. Not litigation. Social decay. By noon, 3 more signs had appeared across his lawn, smaller, circular placards with QR codes that linked to the HOA's incident reporting portal. A neighborhood newsletter arrived in his inbox, and in it was a short, vague paragraph about emerging concerns over unauthorized installations affecting collective safety, urging residents to stay vigilant and report anomalies via the posted signage. There was no mention of Mark by name, but the timing was surgical. That evening, Mark decided to test something. He placed a motion-triggered camera across from the sycamore, angled discreetly toward the bench. He didn't expect to catch anything revelatory, but he wanted to know who walked by, who paused, who lingered. What he captured instead was not vandalism, but ceremony. At exactly 9:03 p.m., a small group of residents, 4 men and 1 woman, walked in silence toward his property, all dressed in matching dark jackets, carrying clipboards. They stood in a semicircle around the bench, said nothing, wrote something, then walked away in perfect unison. No speaking, no pointing, no gesturing. It had the air of a ritual, something rehearsed and disturbingly sterile. The video had no sound, but the image was clear. Each of them had paused just long enough for Mark to recognize their faces from the HOA board directory. Beverly Downing was not among them, but her lieutenants had made their presence known. The next morning, Mark received a formal summons to appear at a special HOA hearing scheduled for the following Monday. The letter used language typically reserved for disciplinary boards: pattern of persistent non-compliance, potential breach of community integration policy. It included a demand to provide documentation proving intent and safety compliance for the installation of the bench, with a warning that failure to justify its existence could lead to formal censure and forced property adjustment, an ambiguous phrase that appeared nowhere in the public handbook. That same afternoon, the doorbell rang. Standing there was a woman Mark hadn't seen before. Early 30s, professional attire, not part of the usual HOA staff. She introduced herself only as Julia and said she had been contracted as an external assessor for neighborhood harmony analysis. Mark asked who had contracted her. She didn't say. He asked for ID. She produced a laminated badge with a vague logo that didn't match any known municipal agency. He didn't let her in, but she lingered on his porch for 12 minutes, taking notes and occasionally glancing back at the bench like it was radiating heat. By the time Sunday came, Mark had drafted a formal reply to the hearing notice. It was 4 pages long, citing specific code violations on behalf of the board, inconsistencies in procedural escalation, and precedent from over a dozen similar cases he himself had ruled on. He attached photographs, affidavits from 2 neighbors he trusted to remain neutral, and a notarized declaration stating the bench had been constructed in compliance with all structural safety standards. He printed 5 copies and brought them in person to the HOA office, requesting written confirmation of receipt. At the hearing, which was held in the community's multipurpose room under the watchful eyes of framed landscape art and fire code posters, Mark was not seated at the table, but instead placed in a chair 6 feet away, like a defendant. The board members, all 7, sat in a line, no nameplates, no introductions. Beverly arrived late, took her seat at the center, and opened the meeting by saying, "We are here today not to pass judgment, but to preserve harmony." They didn't ask questions. They read statements. Each board member had prepared a paragraph, and each paragraph was a different flavor of discomfort. References to cultural continuity, the psychology of communal trust, visual permanence, and the danger of precedent. The word bench was mentioned only once in passing. It wasn't about the bench anymore. It was about the fact that Mark had resisted, publicly, calmly, and with precision. That made him dangerous. That made him worth isolating. When it was his turn to respond, he read his letter aloud, without inflection, letting the language of policy hang in the air. It was too measured for them to interrupt, too precise to refute in the moment. Beverly's face remained unreadable, but 2 of the other members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. After he finished, no verdict was given. Beverly simply said, "The board will confer and issue a notice within 5 business days." Mark stood, nodded once, and left the room. As he walked past the reception desk, Claudia looked up briefly, then lowered her gaze. That night, the bench was still there. The signs were gone, but a small envelope had been placed beneath one of the legs. Inside it was a single sentence written in block letters. "The last person who tested the process moved out." No signature. No date, just another layer of pressure in a game that had now become undeniably deliberate. Mark sat on the bench for a long time, the paper resting on his knee. He looked up at the stars, the same way he had done as a child, quiet, analytical, waiting for patterns. And in that moment, he no longer felt like a newcomer observing a strange culture. He felt like a man being targeted by a system he thought he understood, and the realization that this game was far more sophisticated and personal than he anticipated settled over him like the slow descent of night. Mark didn't sleep much after the hearing. Not from anxiety, but from the steady hum of his brain processing every word, every silence, every shift of the eyes he had witnessed in that windowless room. He replayed the scene not as a memory, but as evidence, hearing the cadence of the statements, cataloging the subtext, noting how each board member avoided using his name directly. The language was depersonalized to the point of abstraction, as if they had crafted a vocabulary specifically designed to erase individual identity and replace it with classifications. Outlier, disruptive element, catalyst for deviation. Not once did they acknowledge that what they were doing had anything to do with him as a person. The bench was now just a symbol, a fixed point of resistance that threatened the invisible scaffolding holding their structure in place. 3 days after the hearing, Mark received a sealed envelope slid under his door. No postage, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded once. The header was blank. The body of the message simply stated, "The board has chosen not to pursue further action, provided there are no additional incidents of non-alignment." It was the closest thing to a surrender they were capable of, and even in their retreat they framed it as a benevolence. No apology, no acknowledgement of fault, just a bureaucratic olive branch wrapped in passive syntax. Mark sat at his desk, reading the sentence over and over, not because he doubted its meaning, but because he recognized what it truly signified. They were recalibrating. He hadn't won. He had disrupted the algorithm. Now they would regroup and find another way. Later that week, he noticed a change in pattern. The signs were gone, yes, but in their place came gestures. People who had previously ignored him now waved with overly bright smiles, asking him about weather or gardening tips. Children passed his house more often, their laughter deliberately loud, too performative. A man from 2 streets over, someone Mark had never spoken to, stopped by to offer leftover firewood he was supposedly trying to get rid of. Mark accepted the bundle politely but noted that each log was freshly cut and cleanly stacked, with no signs of wear. He set them aside and never burned them. On Saturday morning, the tone shifted again. A thick manila folder arrived by courier, official, sealed, and bearing the stamp of a local planning and development office. Inside was a proposed amendment to the Community Development Charter, listing new regulations for all external fixtures of semi-permanent nature within residential parcels. The language had been crafted with surgical precision, technically neutral, but aimed like a rifle at installations like Mark's bench. A supporting document showed proposed illustrations, and on the final page was a single image labeled Non-Compliant Structures, Example A. It was a photo of Mark's bench, digitally altered to appear cracked and leaning, with a child's toy placed beneath it for effect. Below the image was a caption, "Potential hazard scenario. Improvised seating." Mark felt no surge of anger, only clarity. They were going legislative now, elevating the conflict from localized enforcement to communal policy. He understood the move. In a system where authority couldn't justify its actions through rules already in place, it would simply invent new ones and apply them retroactively. This wasn't about right or wrong. It was about control through narrative. The narrative was shifting, and he had become the example. It was no longer about removing the bench. It was about building consensus that the bench never belonged there in the first place. He needed leverage. That evening, Mark drove out of the neighborhood, something he rarely did since moving in, and visited the county records office. He requested all HOA filings from the past 10 years, especially anything related to the Cedar Pines subdivision. The clerk, visibly exhausted and indifferent, printed out a long list of digital entries and offered him a USB stick with the associated files. Mark took it home and spent the next 48 hours combing through documentation, flagging inconsistencies, cross-referencing board appointments, policy changes, and internal communications that had been filed as public record under legal obligation. What he discovered wasn't just revealing, it was alarming. Over the past 6 years, the Cedar Pines HOA had passed 27 amendments to its charter. 22 of those had been submitted during off-cycle board sessions. Of those 22, 19 had been authored by the same 3 individuals. Furthermore, the board elections had not changed hands in over 5 years. Instead, board roles rotated within a closed circle of 5 residents, never expanding beyond that number. No public nominations had been accepted, despite being mandated every second term. The minutes of these meetings, though properly time-stamped, were oddly uniform. Identical phrases reused across years, often citing the same community safety metrics that no one seemed to define. But the most troubling discovery came from a parcel ledger attached to a development initiative. According to the documents, the HOA had secured a variance agreement with the City Council that would allow for limited restructuring of common space boundaries to accommodate a proposed greenway expansion, a proposal that never materialized. The variance, however, remained active, and under that provision, the HOA had gradually redrawn boundaries around select properties, reclassifying portions of private lawns as shared use zones for potential future improvements. Mark's property was, among them. In effect, the land beneath his bench, though originally part of his parcel, had been redesignated, quietly, legally, and without notification, as a provisional green space perimeter buffer. The notice of this change had been filed during a Christmas Eve session with only 2 board members present and approved without a community vote. The implications were massive. It meant they didn't need to prove the bench was unsafe. They could simply claim it violated zoning use. The foundation had been laid months before he even moved in. Mark leaned back in his chair and stared at the screen, his thoughts sharp and still. This wasn't incompetence, it was design. A long, slow game of redefinition. And now he understood why the hostility toward him had been immediate. His presence disrupted the timeline. The bench wasn't the first structure to be challenged, it was the first one to push back. The next day, Mark contacted a zoning compliance analyst he knew from a previous case. They agreed to review the documents under the radar. A day later, she confirmed what he suspected. The reclassification violated procedural order. No physical inspection had been done. No site surveys. The boundary change had been pushed through on the basis of a vague environmental initiative that had never been formally proposed or budgeted. In her words, "This isn't how that's supposed to work, and if you escalate, they'll fold. But they'll make it painful." That night, Mark printed everything, documents, emails, annotated maps, and compiled it into a presentation-style binder. Then he hand-delivered it to the HOA office, not with a threat, not with demands, but with a single cover page that read, "Clarification request regarding boundary designation and development protocols, parcel 14A." He didn't wait for a response. The following morning, Beverly knocked on his door for the first time. She was alone. No clipboard, no security, just her usual poise and a small envelope in hand. Mark stepped onto the porch, and they stood face to face in silence for a moment. "You've done your homework," she said eventually. "I believe in understanding the framework before negotiating with it." Beverly handed him the envelope. Inside was a single page. "The board has voted to retract Amendment 14A and rescind its zoning request concerning Parcel 14A, effective immediately." Mark nodded. He didn't thank her. Beverly hesitated, her fingers clasped tightly in front of her. "Do you plan to go further with this?" "I haven't decided," he said. "That depends on what happens next." She studied him for a long moment, then turned and walked away, her heels clicking softly on the concrete. When she reached the sidewalk, she paused, turned slightly, and said, "You know, most people would have just taken the bench down." Mark looked past her toward the sycamore. "That's probably why you expected me to." That night he received no threats. No signs appeared, no notes. For the first time since moving in, his porch light didn't feel like a spotlight. But, as he sat on the bench, binder still open beside him, he understood the deeper truth. This was only the midpoint. The game had changed, but it hadn't ended. They had tested him. He had exposed them. And now they were retreating, not in defeat, but in strategic silence. Because people like Beverly Downing didn't lose. They recalculated. The uneasy quiet that followed the zoning reversal was not a resolution. It was a pause. Mark knew the difference. In systems like this, peace was not absence of conflict. It was repositioning. He continued his days as before, reading on the porch, maintaining his yard, exchanging minimal pleasantries, but underneath that still surface was a sharpened awareness. He paid attention to how long cars lingered near intersections. He noticed new names on public mailboxes, the sudden repainting of a fence that had been untouched for years. The HOA had pulled back, yes, but not because they accepted defeat. They were recalculating, reworking the formula. 3 days after Beverly's visit, an envelope appeared in his mailbox. No logo this time, no official letterhead, just a typed message on crisp paper offering him a position on a Community Compliance Observational Group, a newly formed committee intended to promote collaborative homeowner oversight and integrated code awareness. The phrasing was deliberately sterile, but the intent wasn't subtle. He was being invited inside, not to contribute, but to be absorbed. A man named Michael Lynch had signed the letter, listed as the Internal Program Coordinator. Mark had never heard of him before, nor seen him listed in any official HOA structure. He didn't respond. 2 days later, a second envelope arrived. This time it included a schedule, bi-weekly meetings, suggested talking points, an internal contact sheet. His name was already listed among the members. Again, no demand, just expectation. When silence followed, Mark felt that familiar tension return, not the overt push of regulation, but the colder, more strategic pressure of assimilation. They weren't going to fight him anymore. They were going to make it look like he had joined them. That weekend, a knock came at the door. Not Beverly this time, but a man in his 50s with a calm demeanor, rolled sleeves, and a too casual tone. He introduced himself as Michael Lynch. He claimed to live a few blocks down, but Mark knew every homeowner in the immediate area. Michael said he was just checking in, making sure Mark had received the materials, offering to walk him through the group's structure. He didn't bring any documents. He didn't ask to come inside. He just stood there, relaxed, in a way that only felt casual if you weren't used to watching posture under pressure. Mark asked a few polite questions. Nothing deep, just enough to test consistency. Michael's answers were practiced but not rehearsed. He deflected naturally. He didn't smile too much. He never once said who had appointed him. Mark thanked him, said he'd consider participating, and closed the door with the clear sense that this wasn't a neighbor. It was a proxy. The next day, Mark's internet went out. Then came a missed garbage pickup. His water pressure dropped inexplicably. Calls to utility services resulted in long hold times, disconnected transfers, vague apologies. His package deliveries were rerouted or delayed. A pest control company he never contacted left a voicemail confirming a follow-up service he hadn't scheduled. None of it was violent. None of it was traceable. But each inconvenience felt precisely timed, surgically placed to needle at his composure. Then came the black SUV. It parked 2 houses down for 3 nights in a row, always arriving around dusk, never staying past midnight. The windows were tinted, the engine off. The first night, Mark ignored it. The second, he watched from the upstairs window, noting how no one ever entered or exited. The third night, he walked out casually, as if heading for a jog, and passed the SUV on foot. No plates, no movement, just presence. He returned home, turned off all the lights, and sat in the dark for over an hour. At 11:47 p.m., the SUV pulled away. The next morning, the HOA sent another notice. this one styled as a community behavioral assessment, citing vague concerns about unusual patterns of engagement and a lack of participatory transparency. The letter was unsigned, formatted. Differently than all previous correspondence, and delivered not through the mailbox but placed flat against his front door with painter's tape, as if someone wanted it seen from the street, Mark knew what this was. They'd escalated to psychological pressure. The legal avenues hadn't worked, the policy traps had backfired. Now they were trying to grind him down, not through confrontation, but attrition. Impose enough inconvenience, inject just enough unpredictability, and even the most stable individual begins to question themselves. It was a form of soft destabilization, a tactic used in high-control environments, and it was disturbingly effective. But it only works if the subject doesn't know what's being done. Mark began documenting everything. He set up encrypted backups, created logs of every unusual occurrence, installed a discrete external camera system separate from his main Wi-Fi network, and he started talking, quietly, selectively. Two neighbors who had remained distant now opened up. One confided that her front step had been painted pink by mistake after she declined to join a community cleanup. Another admitted that she received a fine for leaving her recycling bin out 20 minutes past collection time, only after speaking out about HOA fees. The stories trickled in slowly, always framed as offhand comments but unmistakably revealing a pattern. It wasn't just him. Cedar Pines wasn't a community under management. It was a community under quiet coercion. By the end of the week, Mark made a decision. He wouldn't just resist. He would expose. But first, he needed them to overstep. And they would. People like that always did. The moment of escalation came quietly, like the faint hum of power lines before a storm. Mark had been waiting for it, knowing the HOA's second wave of pressure was not an end but a prologue. They had tested his patience with fabricated committees, manipulated utilities, and planted shadows in the form of black SUVs. He had endured, documenting every action, watching with the calm of a man who understood that patience was more dangerous than fury. What they did not know was that he had already pulled the lever that would force them into the open. A week after the behavioral assessment was taped to his door, a courier arrived at the HOA office carrying a package sealed with the crest of the Federal Mediation Bureau. Inside were certified copies of violation notices drafted in Mark's precise language, citing mismanagement of funds, procedural inconsistencies in zoning, and unlawful boundary adjustments. Every member of the board received one, and by evening word had spread through Cedar Pines that an audit had been scheduled. No anonymous neighbor complaints, no carefully staged photos. This time it was official. The next day, Beverly appeared again, not at his door but on the edge of his lawn, hands clasped as if she had been rehearsing how to hold them. She called out his name for the first time, her voice composed but sharpened by strain. He joined her on the sidewalk, not offering to invite her in, letting the distance remain. She told him that the notices were an unnecessary complication, that the board was willing to retract all previous actions if he would agree to withdraw the complaints. Mark listened without interrupting, and when she had finished, he simply said, "This was never about the bench." Her composure faltered for the briefest second, and in that crack of silence lay the truth she could not conceal. They had always known it. Was about control, not wood and nails. That evening, the retaliation came not through paperwork or staged rituals, but through spectacle. As dusk settled, Mark heard voices outside and stepped onto his porch to see a group of residents gathered near the sycamore. Some carried phones, others held signs written hastily with markers. Safety. First. Follow the rules. No exceptions. It was not a protest born of conviction. It was theater, organized to paint him as the problem, to make it seem as if his resistance endangered the entire neighborhood. Beverly stood behind them, not holding a sign, just watching. Mark did not argue, did not try to reason. Instead, he lifted a slim black case from under his arm and opened it on the porch railing. Inside were copies of the documents he had uncovered: the zoning variance fraud, the off-cycle amendments, the reclassification of parcels without vote. He held them up one by one, not speaking loudly, just enough for those closest to hear. "These," he said, "are the real violations." His calmness cut sharper than shouting, and a ripple moved through the crowd. Some lowered their signs. A man in the back muttered something under his breath and left. The spectacle began to collapse under its own artificial weight. Beverly stepped forward then, her mask of composure cracking into visible anger. She accused him of manipulation, of spreading misinformation, of undermining the unity of Cedar Pines. Mark let her speak until her voice carried too far, until neighbors on porches further down the street leaned out to listen. And then he delivered the final blow, not in anger but with surgical precision. He announced his position clearly for all to hear. Federal Arbiter for HOA disputes, appointed under Title 42, authorized to oversee compliance investigations. The silence that followed was electric. The crowd that had gathered to condemn him now stared at Beverly, who stood frozen in the center, stripped of the quiet authority she had cultivated. For the first time since he had moved in, Mark felt the balance shift. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was exposure. The system they had built on intimidation and illusion had been dragged into daylight, and daylight was the one thing it could not survive. The bench remained where it had always been, ordinary and unthreatening, while the power of the board fractured not with a bang, but with the quiet, unsteady shuffle of neighbors walking away. In the days after the confrontation, Cedar Pines shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible at first, like a curtain loosening after being pulled too tightly. The protest that had been staged outside his house evaporated into silence, and no one spoke of it again. The signs disappeared, the nightly SUVs stopped appearing, and the stream of anonymous letters ended. An official notice arrived by certified mail declaring that Beverly Downing had voluntarily resigned as president of the board, though the language of resignation was couched in vague references to personal obligations and new opportunities. 2 other board members stepped down within the week, and the HOA announced an external review committee to oversee a transition of governance. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now lingered at the mailbox a little longer, as if silently acknowledging that something had shifted, though few were brave enough to say it aloud. A couple of residents stopped him on walks, their words careful but sincere. "I'm glad you stood up," or "We've all felt it, but none of us could push back." Mark accepted their gratitude without embracing it, because he understood what it really was: relief that someone else had carried the burden. The bench remained exactly where it had been from the first day, unremarkable and ordinary, shaded by the wide arms of the sycamore. Children began sitting on it after school, leaving chalk marks on the pavement nearby, and older residents sometimes paused to rest there during evening walks. It blended into the rhythm of the neighborhood, transformed from symbol of defiance into a piece of ordinary furniture, which was all it had ever been. Mark knew the victory was temporary. Power structures like Cedar Pines did not vanish. They reassembled in quieter forms, waiting for memory to fade and vigilance to dull. But for now, the system had fractured, and the illusion of absolute control had been broken. He had not only defended himself, but forced a community to glimpse the machinery that had been operating in the shadows. On a cool evening a week later, he sat on the bench as the sun went down, binder closed at his side, watching as porch lights flickered on one by one. He did not feel triumphant. He felt steady. The neighborhood had wanted him to bend, and when he didn't, they had tried to erase him. But he remained, and in remaining, he had reminded them that even in the most carefully controlled environments, resistance was possible. And sometimes resistance was as simple as refusing to stand up from a bench.